Bharat Karnad. He's a national security expert and joins me live from New Delhi. Thanks so much for joining us here on the News Hour on TRT World. Now, this report, it is alarmist, isn't it? Because we're talking about a lot of people. India has 1.3 billion and Pakistan around 200 million people.
Yes, I think it is unnecessarily alarmist. It's the sort of reports that come out every time there's, some statements made by the governments or leaders in India or Pakistan. And again, the notion of the flashpoint, nuclear flashpoint gets revived. The fact of the matter is the chances of nuclear conflagration is near zero, if not zero. So it's not going to happen. And there are several reasons for it that we can discuss if you wish.
Okay.
But this is unnecessarily alarmist and the sort of thing that really doesn't do anyone any good.
And why do you think there would be no chance, near zero chance?
Well, for the as I said, there are several reasons. The main, I think, is most Western strategic or analytical, analysts and so on, do not consider the cultural, socio-cultural aspects for one thing, and they do not consider a very basic military aspect on the other. Let's discuss the cultural, socio-cultural aspects. Until 70 years ago, this was one country. You had a partition and you created a homeland for Muslims of the subcontinent, except 70 years later there are more Muslims in India than there are in Pakistan. So the raison d'etre of the Pakistani states gets undermined because of the simple fact. Then, because there are so many, it's such a large Muslim population in India, you have the situation where it's a divided community. Almost everybody, at least amongst the Pakistani elite, have the immediate relations on the Indian side. And this is a fact of life. And these are ongoing kith and kinship relationships. Now, usually, as you've seen in history, when there are such close ethnic and familial affinities, there's nearly absolute impossibility of annihilatory wars or wars of annihilation, which is what will occur if either side uses nuclear weapons.
But
so it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
The other thing I mentioned was the military aspect, and the military aspect is something called the exchange ratio. How much can one country absorb by way of destruction and damage compared to what that country can impose on its adversary? Now, in a nuclear exchange, and this has been gamed extensively all over the world, in America, for instance, and certainly in India, and I'm sure in Pakistan as well, you have an exchange ratio wherein for the destruction of 2 Indian cities, virtually Pakistan becomes extinct.
Okay.
Now, this is the kind of
scenarios,
the most obvious kind of deterrent against the use of nuclear weapons by Pakistan. It's a weaker country and more likely, and because it usually talks about initial and first use of nuclear weapons as a means of deterring India, a larger, bigger country with a much more powerful.
And that is the point I want to ask you, because the defense minister, he made headlines in August on this very point about the no first use. But he also said something that is concerning. He says, until today, our nuclear first policy is no first use, but what happens in the future depends on circumstances. So, what are we to read from that statement?
No, I think the point, I think, is the no first use, as just about everybody knows, declaratory no first use kind of strategy that India has adopted, that China has adopted, etc., is usually meant in peacetime, really. Once the first shots are fired, even in conventional hostilities, there's always a chance of, the hostilities escalating to the nuclear level. And this is the problem. So when the defense minister here, Mr. Rajnath Singh, a couple of months back, or just a month and a half back, talked about rethinking or reconsidering the possibility of first use, he was stating the obvious. Every nuclear country has the initial use or first use option. But your declaratory stance may be no first use, but that doesn't mean a thing.
Okay.
And by the way, the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, that's in Delhi right now, did say in its 2014 election manifesto that they would revise the nuclear doctrine. And by the way, a nuclear doctrine is not something written, in stone. It's merely a guideline for a government or a military to conform to. But in war, when the hostilities start, then all options are open. And that's true for any country. It's not just India, Pakistan. It's as true for China, which again has a declaratory no first use stance.
Right.
So India is not very different in that sense. And defense minister saying that we are reconsidering means nothing very much, because that option was always on the table, as it is for every other nuclear weapon state.
All right, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm sure many people concerned about or hearing this report will be too. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us on TRT World, Mr. Bharat Karnad. Thank you.